I found her note crumpled in the side pocket of her purse. I'd been looking for loose change, some quarters for the laundromat, a dull and mechanical errand. And my fingertips grazed the folded slip of paper. It felt almost damp with the weight of what it said. If he finds out, say it was a mistake. Say you were scared. Say it's not about sex. Tell him you love him. I read those words again and again. The pen strokes were light, cautious, as if the writer, or maybe Lauren McCarthy, my wife, didn't want to leave a deep imprint. As if it were practice for an apology she hoped she'd never have to make. But the lines told me something else. It wasn't just guilt. It was planning. Rehearsal. An entire story ready to be deployed the moment I confronted her. A script for pity. I lifted my head, and in the hush of the house, I heard the dull click of a phone being locked. I recognized the muffled chime. Her phone. Probably. One of those typical everyday sounds that I'd never noticed before. Now it felt like a shard of glass under my skin. I didn't rush upstairs. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the coffee table, or tear the pages or storm around the living room. Instead, I tucked the note back into her bag and closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to remember that this was my wife, Lauren McCarthy, the woman I met in college, the woman I laughed with and built dreams with. Now, all of that was overshadowed by a single piece of paper telling me how she'd lie to my face. I can't say the cracks in our relationship weren't there before this moment. We'd grown distant, burying ourselves in routine. But seeing the outline of betrayal spelled out like that, in her own handwriting, was a blow I wasn't ready to handle. Downstairs felt cold, emptier than usual. The walls seemed to close in, and every photograph, the wedding portrait, the silly snapshots from our trip to the Grand Canyon, suddenly looked staged. I could practically hear the echo of her justifications in my head. It was a mistake. I was scared. It's not about sex. I love you. The lines twisted like barbed wire through my mind. My jaw tightened, and I tasted a hint of copper as I bit the inside of my cheek. I wanted to break something, to unleash a rage so big that it would obliterate my confusion. But I remembered how men in my family always taught me. A man doesn't cry. A man endures. So I swallowed. I stared at the purse, at that note, at the small crinkles that my grip had left on the paper, and I waited. When Lauren McCarthy finally descended the stairs, she looked at me with curiosity, maybe a twinge of guilt in her glance. But I only said one word, coffee. She blinked. Sure. Let me just put my phone away. That phone. I imagined the texts, the calls, the pictures, the secrets. But I said nothing more, only nodding curtly. My heart beat loud in my ears, a slow, heavy thud, like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds until everything collapsed. I remember the day I finally saw them together. I'd suspected for weeks. After that note, I'd become a silent observer, an unwelcome detective in my own home. I tracked her movements in small ways. The change of her perfume when she left in the morning, the anxious glances at her phone at dinner, the hush in her voice whenever she called a coworker. The little details hammered at me, one by one. One evening, Lauren McCarthy said she was going to stay late at the office, something about a last-minute meeting with donors. We lived near downtown Seattle, so sometimes those extra hours were normal. But my gut told me to go see for myself. I needed proof. I needed to know if the note in her purse connected to a real physical betrayal, or if I was losing my mind to paranoia. I didn't plan to catch them in the act. Part of me prayed I wouldn't see anything at all. I drove through the drizzle, pulling my car discreetly behind an office building across the street. The rain blurred my windshield. I waited. Her car was still in the lot. Lights glowed in a third-story window. My nerves twisted in knots. And then I saw him walk out to the curb, phone pressed to his ear, as though giving directions to someone. The way he carried himself, confident, upright, a man who believed the world admired him, matched the brief glimpses I'd caught at some fundraiser months ago, when Lauren first introduced me to Michael Ross. He was a personal coach, some big-shot self-help guru who gave motivational speeches to nonprofits. We shook hands politely back then. Now I hated the sight of his slicked back hair, the stupid grin, the smirk. Something about him reeked of arrogance, but Lauren had insisted he was just a business contact. He disappeared into the building once more. For 15 agonizing minutes, I stared at the rain-streaked windows, wondering if I even had the courage to follow. My seatbelt felt suffocating. Blood pounded in my temples. Then the overhead lights on the third floor went out. I inhaled, told myself to calm down, and stepped out into the wet darkness. Inside, the corridors were mostly vacant. The echo of my footsteps on the linoleum made my gut churn. I didn't want to get caught sneaking around. But I had come too far to turn back. When I pushed open the heavy glass door to the main corridor, I heard distant voices. Laughter, a woman's hush. My wife's hush. I moved down the hall until I found the source, a side room with partially frosted windows. The door was ajar, letting me see silhouettes first. One figure pinned against the wall, the other leaning in. A jacket dropped to the floor. For half a second, my mind begged me to turn away. Then I heard a whisper. Her voice. "Mike, I'm sorry about earlier." His laugh. Confident. "No worries. You're here now." I clenched my fists. My legs felt like stone, yet I took another step, my gaze focusing on the glass pane. The angle changed, and I saw them more clearly. Lauren McCarthy, her hair undone, the collar of her blouse tugged aside. Michael Ross leaning into her, his hand at her waist. I saw him kiss her neck, saw her tilt her head back with half-closed eyes. I felt a surge of heat in my lungs, like a sudden flame. My stomach twisted as if I'd been punched. The adrenaline told me to rip open the door, to make him pay, to scream at Lauren. But I froze. My heart hammered, and the memory of that note in her purse blazed through my skull. This was the scene. This was the reality behind it. She'd rehearsed how to ask for my forgiveness. But right here, she wasn't hesitating. She wasn't fumbling with guilt. She was pressing into him with parted lips, letting him roam his hands under the edge of her blouse. Even through the haze of my shock, I caught the erotic tension. My wife. Another man. My vision blurred around the edges. I took a step back, then another. I nearly collided with a potted plant behind me. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight. My mind roared with conflicting instincts. Expose them. Run. Yell. Fight. But I did none of it. Instead, I retreated like a wounded animal, stumbling down the hallway until I reached the exit. And only when I got to my car, slamming the door shut, did I let out a furious growl, a sound from deep in my throat, ragged and hushed, because I still didn't want to be discovered. I banged my head against the steering wheel once, twice. The pain was dull, meaningless compared to the storm inside me. The rain battered the roof of the car, and I stared at that building for a long time, imagining them finishing whatever they were doing, walking out with guilty smiles. "Don't cry," I told myself. Just don't. That was the first time in my life I felt truly hollow. "A man does not cry," I repeated. But my eyes stung, and my throat constricted with unshed tears. The note. The images I'd just seen. My own wife. Another man's lips on her. My own sense of failure. All of it curled into a single, all-consuming ache. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away, not caring where I was going. I cruised through side streets, ignoring the traffic signals. My phone buzzed at some point. Lauren, probably, or maybe a coworker. I didn't answer. I just kept driving, letting the city lights pass in a blur. Rain smeared the night. I ended up parking by a deserted lot near the waterfront, letting the engine idle. My mind reeled with questions, regrets, anger. I didn't know how to face her. Didn't know how to face myself. I never made a scene. Maybe I should have. My father would have told me that a real man defends his honor, grabs the traitor by the collar, and sets things straight. But I couldn't see straight. I couldn't feel. It was like my senses had been numbed by betrayal, or perhaps I was too caught in a strange guilt. Should I have done something differently? Did I push her away? That sense of blame ate at me. When I got home late that night, Lauren McCarthy was already in bed. She didn't stir. Maybe she was asleep, or maybe she was pretending. Either way, I went to the living room couch, sank into the cushions, and stared at the dark ceiling. Over and over, my mind replayed the scene. The way she looked in that moment, pressed against the wall, lips parted for him. My stomach clenched every time. Morning came, and she acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, an automatic gesture. I jerked away, but didn't say anything. She gave me a quizzical glance. "What's wrong?" she asked, voice gentle. I shrugged. "Busy day at work." "Oh, okay." She paused, uncertain. "Look, I'm sorry I got in so late. It was, well, the meeting with donors ran over." I looked into her eyes, searching for a hint of shame. I saw it there, flickering, but she was good at covering. I pictured her note again, the lines she planned to recite. And I said nothing. One word, a grunt, then off to work. I started sleeping in my car after that. Not because I couldn't stand the same bed, that came later, but because my confusion and anger wouldn't let me rest. I parked down the street, engine off, seat reclined. My breath fogged the windows at night. The chill of Washington's damp climate seeped into my bones, but I preferred that cold to the suffocating tension inside the house. Lauren McCarthy would text me around midnight sometimes. "Where are you? Are you okay?" I'd glance at the messages, then lock my phone. The same soft click I'd heard from her device. I let her worry, because I wasn't ready to confront her, wasn't ready to see her contrite performance. I felt like everything was her script now, her pity speech. A part of me wanted to see how she'd handle my silent defiance. One weekend, after another restless night in the car, I found a new note in her phone, this time not tucked away, but open on the screen as she left it charging in the kitchen. She must have forgotten to lock it. I saw the text snippet. "Michael Ross. Let's talk tomorrow. We can figure it out." Lauren, figure what out, exactly? How they keep sneaking behind my back. I locked the phone, placed it face down. Then I went out to the backyard, rummaging through the old trailer we planned to sell a year ago. It was musty inside, smelled of stale cushions and disuse, but I decided that day I'd make it my new home. A silent kind of punishment for both of us, or maybe it was my attempt to keep distance, to control my environment. I set about cleaning it, moving some of my clothes in. Lauren McCarthy watched from the back steps, hugging her arms around her chest, eyes full of questions. "John?" she asked, voice quivering. I paused, a box of old baseball trophies in my arms. "Yeah," she took a breath. "What are you doing?" I kept my tone even, emotionless. "Moving." "Why?" She tried to step closer, but I turned away. "John, talk to me. Please." I only shrugged. "I'm tired." She swallowed. I saw her parted lips, the lines around her eyes that used to be from laughter. Now they seemed carved by fear. "If this is about me coming home late, it's just work, you know." I cut her off with a wave of my hand and slid into the trailer. I wanted to say something vile, to expose that I knew everything. But I couldn't form the words. I just shut the door, leaving her outside. Through the small window, I watched her stand there in silence, hugging herself, uncertain. Eventually, she walked back into the house. Inside the trailer, with dust motes drifting in pale sunlight, I sat on the tiny built-in couch and let out a trembling breath. I was a man undone. The marriage I believed in had turned false, yet my chest tightened with a bizarre sense of responsibility. Maybe if I had been more romantic, more attentive, the illusions that somehow I was at fault kept swirling. I knew I shouldn't blame myself for her affair, but there it was, lodged in my heart. The next few weeks blurred into a quiet standoff. She'd be in the house, making dinner or flipping through my old photos, and I'd be in the trailer, lying awake at night. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her looking at me from the kitchen window. A subtle shake of her head. Sadness, regret. At work, I functioned on autopilot. My colleagues asked if I was okay. I said fine. I buried my face in spreadsheets, answered a few calls. The highlight of my day became the solitary drive back to my trailer. People talk about the comfort of home, but my comfort was the enclosed shell of that rundown camper, hearing the hum of traffic in the distance. One evening, I heard the front door open and close. Through the small curtains, I saw Michael Ross stepping onto our porch, wearing his neat sport jacket, his hair combed back in that practiced style. Fury ignited in me, but instead of bursting out to confront him, I sat by the trailer window, hidden in shadow, and watched. My wife let him in. I waited for raised voices, or maybe confessions. Instead, I heard them talking in low tones. I couldn't make out every word, but I got the gist. He was urging her to come with him, to resolve this situation. She was stammering about how complicated it was, how she never meant for it to reach this point. A wild thought crossed my mind. Maybe I should storm in, fists clenched. But something kept me rooted in place. I stared at my hands, noticing the tremor. I was a man who'd never been prone to violence. I didn't even get in many fights as a boy. But at that moment, I felt my body tighten with an urge to break him, to see fear in his confident eyes. Instead, I reached for my phone and ordered something online. A self-help book. Some ironically titled Guide to Relationships. I wanted him to have it. I wanted him to feel my presence in his life in a way that made him squirm. A petty move, maybe, but it was a start. Populum, brat. I'd write, half sarcastically, letting him know I wasn't ignorant, letting him know he shared this mess with me now. They stayed inside for nearly an hour. I saw the silhouettes through the window, her posture stiff, his arms moving dramatically as he tried to persuade her. The tension in my chest grew heavier by the minute. Finally, he left, stepping off the porch with a quick glance toward the driveway. His gaze brushed the trailer, but he didn't see me. Not really. He just turned on his heel and walked to his car. The engine roared off into the night. I exhaled, releasing a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. An hour later, Lauren McCarthy slipped into the trailer. She didn't knock. She just opened the door slightly and whispered, "John, are you awake?" I switched on the small lamp. She looked drained, her blouse rumpled, hair a bit askew. Dark circles rimmed her eyes. She waited for my response. When none came, she stepped inside, careful, as though entering a stranger's house. She cleared her throat. "I know you're angry." I said nothing. She bit her lip, eyes shining with unused tears. "John, My stare pinned her in place. My heart pounded, but I kept my face impassive. She tried again. "I made a mistake. I was scared. You were always so distant lately, and the script, the lines from her note." My mouth twisted in bitterness. She saw it in my expression and stuttered. "It's not about sex, you know. It's complicated, but I do love you. I really do." A shaky breath. It happened. And I cut her off with a single word, voice hoarse. "Go." She trembled, tears sliding down her cheeks. She whispered, "Please." I turned away and looked at the walls of the trailer. The mustard yellow wallpaper peeled at the corners. "Leave." For a moment, she stood frozen, heartbreak etched on her face. Then she slowly walked out. The door clicked shut, and I listened to her footsteps retreat across the yard. When her form disappeared inside the house, I let out a breath that rattled in my chest. Part of me wanted to run after her, to scream, to collapse in tears. But I just stared at the empty space where she'd stood, my hands clenched, my heart bruised. In the morning, I found a delivery confirmation on my phone. The self-help book I'd sent to Michael Ross had arrived at his address. With it, I'd included a note that read, "We share this story now. I hope you learned something." John McCarthy. Petty. Absolutely. But it gave me a twinge of grim satisfaction. I wanted him to feel that I was not some clueless, spineless husband who'd vanish in the background. I existed, and I was angry. Still, that fleeting satisfaction did nothing to repair the wound that was festering inside me. Lauren McCarthy kept her distance most days. She'd watch me from the porch, maybe sip her coffee in the mornings, eyes darting toward the trailer. I'd pretend not to notice. At night, I heard her pacing through the house, maybe rummaging the drawers. I spotted the glow of her phone screen through the window. She was likely reading my old posts or watching the silly videos I used to upload. I had a small channel once, talking about keeping promises and living with integrity. Funny how life turned out. I noticed she'd started wearing her hair in a different style, pinned back, as if she was trying to revert to an old version of herself. Some nights, she'd linger by the trailer, maybe hoping I'd let her in. I never did. I just lay in the darkness, a swirl of half-formed thoughts circling my head. Should I be furious? Should I forgive? Should I leave? I felt the cold silence growing heavier between us. And in that silence, my anger simmered. I found I didn't want her contrition. I wanted her to drown in the guilt, to feel every ounce of the heartbreak she'd caused. The bed in the house might have been warm, but I wanted none of it. The trailer's cramped bunk felt like a prison cell, but at least it was my cell. A place I chose. Michael Ross didn't show his face for a while after that. Maybe he sensed the tide turning, or maybe Lauren told him we needed space. But I kept imagining the two of them, hidden away, continuing their affair in some cheap motel or in the backseat of his polished sedan. My mind conjured images I hated, her undone blouse, his hands roaming. The taste of betrayal itched on her lips. I tried to shake them off, but they came at night, in my nightmares, leaving me sweaty and breathless. I started skipping work occasionally, claiming sick days. I'd park my car at a viewpoint overlooking the water, stare at the harbor, and wonder how I got here. I had once believed in love, in marriage, in the vow to remain faithful. But now I was a hollowed-out man, too hurt to cry, too exhausted to fight. Why didn't I just walk away? The question haunted me. One morning, I walked back into the house to grab a spare jacket. It was bitterly cold outside, and the trailer's tiny heater couldn't compete. Lauren McCarthy was in the kitchen, wearing one of my old sweatshirts, her hair messy. She looked up at me, eyes wide. "John," she said softly. I paused at the threshold. "I just need my jacket. It's in the closet." She followed me as I moved, silent except for her shuffling footsteps. She smelled like lavender, my favorite scent on her. A memory of better times flickered in my mind, the two of us dancing in the living room. No music, just quiet laughter. Now we were strangers. I opened the closet door and reached for the coat, ignoring her gaze. "John," she tried again. "Let's talk." I sighed, stared at the floor. "About what?" She swallowed. Then the script. "I'm sorry. Really, I didn't want to hurt you." "Stop." My voice came out harsh. "Don't." She touched my arm, and I flinched away. I saw tears well up in her eyes. "I know you hate me," she whispered. "But please, let me explain." "What's there to explain?" I said quietly. "I saw you. I know about Michael Ross." She winced. It's not about sex. It just... We were. The notes lines. "It was a mistake. You love me. You were scared." My jaw tensed. "I don't want your rehearsed story." I turned to leave, coat in hand. She grabbed my sleeve, desperation in her voice. "Then punish me, but don't shut me out." Her words echoed in the hallway. Punish her. The idea twisted my gut. I pulled free and strode out. A man does not cry, I reminded myself. But I felt a prick of moisture in my eyes, which I angrily blinked away. A few days passed in agonizing slowness. The nights in the trailer turned colder, but I refused to re-enter the house for anything more than a quick shower or a change of clothes. Lauren McCarthy's presence weighed on me, even from a distance. My coworkers noticed something was deeply wrong. I brushed them off with one-word answers. One late afternoon, I got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity overcame me. "Hello." A pause. Then a man's voice, low and unsteady. "Him. Michael Ross. John McCarthy," he said. I got your book." I felt a surge of adrenaline, gripping the phone tighter. "So?" He hesitated. "Look, I'd like to talk. Man to man." My lips curled in a bitter half-smile. The nerve of him. "No. Please, just 10 minutes." He exhaled. "It's about Lauren." The name struck me like a punch. My chest tightened. I wanted to tell him to go to hell. But for reasons I still can't define, maybe curiosity, maybe masochism, I said, "Fine. There's a diner on 5th and Willow. Tomorrow at 6. He murmured a quick thanks, and the call ended with a beep. I locked my phone, hearing that same small click, and exhaled slowly. My heart hammered. I felt fury swirling in my veins, but part of me wanted this confrontation. Maybe I needed to see the face of the man who'd shattered my life, and make him feel my anger. The next evening, I arrived first, sliding into a corner booth. The vinyl seat cracked along the edges. The place was quiet, mostly older folks sipping coffee, the faint smell of fried bacon lingering. A waitress approached. I ordered black coffee. My reflection in the window looked gaunt, older, as though the last few weeks had aged me a decade. Michael Ross walked in, scanning the diner until he spotted me. He wore a tailored coat, and his hair was perfectly styled, as usual. My stomach churned. He slid into the booth across from me. I said nothing, just stared. "John." He tried a polite nod. "Thanks for meeting me." I didn't respond. He cleared his throat. "Look, I don't think words can fix this, but I wanted to make sure you understand it wasn't some cheap fling. Lauren was." My voice came out cold. "Stop using her name." He raised his eyebrows. Okay. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into my palms. Then I spoke quietly. "You're part of this story now. She wrote a note about how to lie to me. I saw you with her. It's not complicated. You betrayed me. She betrayed me." He swallowed, glancing at the table. His composure flickered. "I'm not proud of it." He paused, searching for words. "You know, she was lonely. She said you barely talked to her." My knuckles went white against the cup. "You think that justifies it?" "No," he conceded, voice low. "It was a mistake. We got carried away." "But," he inhaled, eyes flicking up to meet mine. "She's not a bad person, John. She's hurting. She feels awful." I leaned back, a humorless laugh escaping me. "You want me to forgive her? Is that it?" He seemed unsure how to answer. I don't want anyone to keep suffering. Even you." The sheer arrogance in his tone made me want to smash the mug. But I kept myself in check. A man does not cry. A man does not break. I forced my voice to remain steady. "So what now, Michael Ross? Are you still seeing her?" His gaze faltered. "No." She cut it off. I snorted. "Right. After you two had your fun." He pressed his lips together. "John, I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say." I stared at him, taking in every detail. His manicured nails, the slight tension in his jaw, the cologne that wafted across the table. I remembered how I'd once shaken this man's hand at a fundraiser, never guessing he'd become my wife's lover. My stomach turned. "Sorry," I repeated quietly. "You're sorry?" He nodded. "Yeah." I nodded too, slowly. Then I leaned forward, letting each word drop like a lead weight. You destroyed my marriage. You took what wasn't yours. You walked into my home, my life, and gave her a taste of something she thought she needed. And you're sorry. His breath hitched. He gave a small nod. I noticed a flicker of guilt in his eyes, or maybe just fear. I considered him for another moment, then slid out of the booth. I tossed a few bills on the table for the coffee. Don't come back to my house, I said. Don't call me. Don't text me. We're done here. He opened his mouth, maybe to protest, but I'd already turned my back and walked away. My exit was calm on the outside, but inside, every nerve rattled. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap, and I stood by my car for a moment, trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. That conversation gave me no closure. It was just another layer of emptiness. I confronted Lauren McCarthy later that night. Not the confrontation with screaming or broken dishes that you see in movies, but a quiet, seething confrontation that cut deeper. I marched into the house and found her in the living room. She jumped at my sudden entrance. "John," she breathed. I didn't expect. I didn't wait for her greeting. I talked to him. Michael Ross. Her face paled. She slowly set down the mug she was holding. "You." What did he say? I scoffed. "He said you ended it." Her eyes filled with tears. I did. I swear. I rubbed a hand over my face. "Why, Lauren McCarthy, why did you do it to begin with?" She inhaled sharply, tears threatening to spill. I was lonely. We were drifting apart. You were always distant, and I felt invisible. And Michael, he paid attention. He listened. He said all the right things. A flicker of pain stabbed my chest. "I never stopped loving you," I muttered. She reached out, but I stepped back. "Don't," I warned. My voice cracked slightly, betraying my composure. "Don't you dare," she sobbed, shoulders trembling. "I'm sorry. I know that means nothing right now, but I am." I wanted to scream that she'd destroyed everything, that my nights in the trailer were a direct result of her betrayal. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my breathing. "You wrote that note. You planned how to lie to me." She paled further. "What note?" I stared at her. "The one in your purse. If he finds out, say it was a mistake. It's not about sex. You love him." Her eyes flickered with recognition. Tears spilled over. That was me being terrified of losing you. I didn't know how to come clean." "Come clean," I repeated bitterly. "You were never going to." She shook her head, hands covering her face. "I don't know. Maybe I was too much of a coward. Maybe I thought if you never found out, I could just..." She broke off, sobbing. "I'm a horrible person." I felt the sting of tears in my own eyes. A man doesn't cry. My father's voice, my fists clenched, nails digging into my palms. "I was right here, Lauren McCarthy," I said softly, voice trembling with pain. "If something was wrong, we could have talked. But you chose him. Now you want me to fix your guilt." She sank to the couch, burying her face in her hands. Her sobs filled the silent house. I stood there, arms limp at my sides, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. I wanted to comfort her, to hold her, my old instincts, but I stayed rigid, stone-faced, because the betrayal still burned too bright. Finally, I whispered, "I can't stay in this house." She looked up, desperation etched across her features. "What can I do?" I shook my head, turned on my heel, and walked out. In the foyer, I paused only long enough to grab a spare blanket. I heard her muffled sobs behind me. My chest felt too tight to draw breath. And then I was gone, stepping back into the chill of the night, returning to my self-imposed exile in the trailer. Days turned into weeks. Lauren McCarthy and I existed as two separate lives on the same property. She had the house, I had my trailer. She tried to fix it, to talk, to apologize, but I kept everything inside. My anger, my heartbreak, my false sense of blame. I replayed our entire relationship in my head. The good times, the gestures of love, the quiet nights when we cuddled by the fireplace. It all felt tainted now. Michael Ross stayed away. Every so often, a text from an unknown number would appear on my phone. I guessed it might be him or someone from Lauren's circle. I deleted them unread. My nights were spent in restless sleep, dozing off to the faint hum of cars on the highway, imagining Lauren alone in our bed, or maybe crying in the dark. Part of me craved her closeness, the warmth of her body, but the sting of betrayal overshadowed everything else. On a rare morning, I saw her in the backyard, hanging laundry. She wore a simple summer dress, hair pinned up, her profile outlined by the early sun. She looked so familiar, so heartbreakingly beautiful, that I nearly forgot. Then I remembered. I turned away, choking on the bitterness in my throat. I never demanded an official divorce, never moved out entirely. Maybe that was my twisted form of revenge, letting her existence revolve around a silent man who wouldn't give her closure. I saw her wither in that guilt, her posture drooping, her voice timid. Yet every time I approached, the anger rose again, scorching my resolve. The day my self-help gift was finally acknowledged, I just pulled into the driveway after a supply run. An envelope lay on the trailer's small step, my name scrawled on it in a script I didn't recognize. Inside, a single piece of stationery with typed text. I got your message. I understand. M. Ross. No other words. No plea for forgiveness. No explanation. Just acknowledgement. I stared at it, a dull fury swirling in my chest. He was acknowledging that we were connected in some twisted way. Two men who'd shaped her life. One husband. One lover. My eyes burned as I thought of how ironically polite it seemed. I tore the letter to pieces and scattered them on the gravel. Then I stomped them underfoot for good measure. My breath came in ragged bursts, and I realized I was trembling. I hated him. I hated that he existed. But a part of me hated myself more for not protecting what I thought was mine. I stopped going to my job. The heartbreak, the shame, the sleepless nights had worn me down. I'd always been a steady guy, proud of my reliability. Now I was skipping out, ignoring calls, forging doctor's notes if someone pressed me. My boss left voicemails expressing concern. I just let them gather dust. Lauren McCarthy noticed, of course. She cornered me one morning, meeting me at the trailer steps before I could slip away. She looked exhausted, eyes rimmed with red, hair unkempt for once. "John," she said hoarsely, "you're going to lose your job if you keep doing this. Please, let me help." I said nothing, pushing past her. She grabbed my sleeve. "John, look at me." Her voice cracked on the last word. I hesitated, then turned. I gazed at her face, the lines of worry, the faint trace of heartbreak that mirrored my own. For a split second, I remembered how we used to be. The laughter. The quiet Sunday mornings, reading newspapers in bed. That memory slashed at me more painfully than anything else. I managed a single word. "Don't." She swallowed thickly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I can't just stand by while you destroy yourself. Watch me," I said, voice flat. "Go inside, Lauren McCarthy. Let me deal with myself." She choked on a sob. "I hate what I did. I hate myself. If I could take it back, I shook my head, stepped free of her grip, and walked off. My chest felt like it was splitting in two. A man does not cry. I repeated the mantra. But the ache was there, throbbing. Every step, every breath felt heavier. Anger is a strange thing. It can burn hot, fueling wild impulses to lash out. But it can also turn into a slow, toxic coil that wraps around your soul. Mine became the latter. I let it fester. I isolated myself, letting that silent fury become a wall around me. Lauren McCarthy lingered in the house, tiptoeing around the edges of my existence, Maybe she hoped I'd eventually forgive her. And then one night, I realized that my silence was my revenge. It was louder than any shouting match could have been. She'd wake up alone, see my empty side of the bed, or look through the window at the battered old trailer, and know I was out there, fuming in quiet condemnation. She tried to find redemption in my eyes, but I gave her nothing. That was the punishment she'd asked for, in a way. Eventually, the bitterness escalated. She began losing weight, barely sleeping, wide-eyed with guilt and regret. And I just watched. I watched her unravel, piece by piece. Each day, she was more subdued, more haunted. It almost sickened me how much a part of me relished seeing her suffer, but I felt powerless to stop it. My heartbreak demanded retribution. One evening, she approached the trailer again. I was sitting on the small step, gazing at the sky's dying colors, lost in my thoughts. She stopped a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself. "You're living like a ghost," she said softly. "And I deserve that, but I'm begging you. See me. Talk to me. Even if it's just to yell, to scream at me, to call me names. I can't stand this silence." I refused to look at her. My voice came out quiet, heavy. "I don't have anything to say." Her breath caught. "Then let me speak. Let me." She broke off, shoulders trembling. For a moment, I wondered if she'd throw herself at my feet, or if she'd slap me for being so cold, but she just turned away, letting her tears fall, and retreated into the darkness. A week later, I discovered I'd been effectively fired from my job. They mailed me the paperwork, citing my extended absence. I stared at the letter in the trailer, numb. I used to be so proud of providing for us, of maintaining a steady career. Now, because of my refusal to function, everything crumbled. I decided to sell what I could. I started listing old equipment, any valuables I still had. Freed by unemployment, I drifted through the days, ignoring the pang of hunger or the creeping sense of hopelessness. I wanted to punish Lauren McCarthy by showing her that she'd broken me. Yet I also despised myself for letting it go that far. That twisted guilt reared its head again. Maybe if I'd been better, she wouldn't have strayed. One day, I found her in the kitchen, rummaging for food. She looked worn out, hair greasy, eyes lifeless. For the first time, I felt a pang of real concern. She turned to see me watching. We stood in the silent house, the hum of the fridge the only sound. "I put the house up for sale," I said, monotone. She paled. "What?" I nodded, leaning against the counter. "We can't keep it. I can't pay for it. I lost my job. You don't make enough on your own. So I'm selling." She swallowed hard, tears brimming. "But this is our home." I gazed at the worn linoleum floor. "Not anymore." She stared at me, and in her eyes I saw the final flicker of something dying. The love we built, the illusions of a stable life. "We can figure something out." I cut her off. "Don't. It's done." She sobbed once, then turned and collapsed into a chair. I walked away, heading back to the trailer. My footsteps echoed, my heart heavy. Part of me knew I was crossing a line from which there might be no return. But the pain demanded forward motion, demanded that I keep tearing down the remnants of our past. Over the next month, we lived in a surreal limbo. People came to view the property. Lauren McCarthy tried to put on a polite smile when realtors asked about the place. I lurked in the trailer, scowling from a distance. The few offers we got were pitiful, but I was too drained to care. She pleaded with me to reconsider. I gave her silence. A few times, we stood in the hallway, tension thick as tar, and she'd open her mouth, only to be met with my stony glare. I saw the heartbreak in her eyes. I felt the heartbreak in my own chest. We were killing each other slowly, and still, we didn't stop. Michael Ross never reappeared physically, but I suspected he reached out to her in some capacity. I caught glimpses of her phone lighting up, her expression darkening. She never took his calls around me. Maybe she told him to stay away for good. Maybe not. I no longer had the energy to care. My mind was preoccupied with anger, guilt, and the slow disintegration of our shared life. One evening, a storm lashed the area, rain pounding the trailer's tin roof. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the yard. I lay on the trailer bed, listening to the thunder. Suddenly, I heard frantic knocking on the door. John. Lauren's voice, muffled by the downpour. I hesitated, heart pounding, then opened the door. She stood there soaked to the skin, hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes wild. "What?" I asked. She took a shaky breath. "The basement's flooding. The sump pump failed. I need help." My old instincts, fix the problem, protect the house, flared to life. I grabbed my flashlight, followed her inside. Sure enough, water pooled around the basement floor. We scrambled to salvage what we could. I waded knee-deep, yanking old boxes onto shelves. She tried to hook up an old pump, tears mixing with the water on her face. In the chaos, I found myself next to her, kneeling by the circuit panel. We both breathed heavily, our arms covered in grime. The reality of our situation crashed over me like a second flood. This was our basement, our memories. And we were too broken to fix anything together. She looked at me then, desperation in her eyes, and for a moment, it felt like we were back in the early days of our marriage, facing a problem side by side. My throat tightened. The closeness was terrifying. I fought the urge to pull her into my arms. Instead, I forced myself to stand and turn away. "Call a professional," I muttered. "I can't fix this alone." She sank back against the damp wall, shoulders slumping. "John, thank you for helping." I gave a curt nod, stepping around her. My heart pounded from the physical exertion and the emotional weight. Water still seeped in, and the basement was a wreck. But we'd managed to save the major belongings, and the rest, well, it was just stuff. I climbed the stairs, ignoring her trembling figure behind me. The next day, I drove to an auction house, finalizing some sales for old valuables. On my way home, I got another unknown call. This time, I recognized the area code as local. Curious, I answered. A man's voice, authoritative. "Hello, is this John McCarthy?" "Yes. This is Martin from Green Pines Realty. We got an interested buyer for your property. They'd like to move quickly." I rubbed my forehead, a dull ache forming. "Great, send me the info." He gave me a series of details. I hung up, feeling oddly hollow. So the house might sell soon. The final step in severing ties with Lauren McCarthy. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. Is this what I really want? I returned to the trailer. She was out, maybe at her job, maybe grocery shopping. I stared at the battered walls, the cramped space that had become my refuge. The ache in my chest grew heavier. For the first time, I realized I had nowhere else to go once the house sold. No real plan. Just an endless stretch of heartbreak and uncertain tomorrows. That night, I heard her footsteps approach the trailer. A pause, then a tentative knock. I opened the door, found her standing there, eyes rimmed red as always. "I heard from the realtor," she said. "So, that's it then. You're really selling." I ran a hand over my face. "Yes," she swallowed. "We'll have to move out. Soon." I nodded. The silence pulsed between us. She took a shaky breath, like she was summoning courage. "Can we at least talk about what happens after? Do we sign the divorce papers? Are we done?" The word divorce felt like a gut punch. I could hardly speak. Finally, I forced out, "I don't know." She stepped forward, voice trembling. "I hate what I did, John McCarthy. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But if you want me gone, I'll go. I need to know." My gaze slid past her. The trailer's interior lights cast flickering shadows on her face. Her eyes looked so raw, so filled with sorrow. I felt the old love stir under the layers of pain. Then the memory of her pressed against Michael Ross. My stomach twisted. "I can't forget," I said at last, voice thick with emotion. Every time I close my eyes, I see you with him. I hear your rehearsed lines. See that note? It never leaves me. She nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I understand. I exhaled slowly. I might never be able to forgive you, but I can't keep punishing us both forever. Her eyes searched mine. So, what does that mean? I closed my eyes, swallowing a lump in my throat. It means we sell the house. We figure out the details. Then we see if there's anything worth saving. She let out a shaking breath, relief and anguish mingling on her face. Thank you for not shutting me out completely. I said nothing more, and she took that as her cue to leave. Her footsteps receded into the night. I closed the door, heart hammering. I'd said 1,000 words in that short exchange, words laced with heartbreak and a faint glimmer of uncertain possibility. A couple of weeks passed, each day an exercise in slow, raw tension. We packed our belongings, sold off the rest. The yard grew emptier as we readied for the final sale. Our interactions were minimal. Sometimes she'd ask a question about a box or a piece of furniture. I'd grunt a response. She offered me coffee in the mornings. I'd sip in silence, nodding my thanks. One evening, we both ended up in the backyard, each drawn by the mild weather. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. We stood a few feet apart, arms folded. Lauren McCarthy's profile was etched against the dying light. My chest felt tight. I remember, she said softly, when we first bought this place, we thought it would be our forever home. I remained quiet. She glanced at me. John, do you believe in second chances? I stared at the horizon, the edges of the sky darkening. My mind churned with memories, regrets. I don't know, I said honestly. She nodded, tears glistening. I hope one day you will. We watched the sun dip below the skyline. Silence hung between us. I wanted to reach for her hand, but the memory of her betrayal clenched like a fist around my heart. So I just stood there, letting the final rays of daylight slip away. The night before we signed the closing papers, I found myself restless in the trailer. I stepped out into the cool air, gazing at the house that once symbolized my hopes and dreams. My truck was parked out front, loaded with boxes. Hers was next to it, trunk half-packed. Tomorrow, we'd finalize the sale, then part ways, maybe forever. Something in me snapped. I marched across the yard and entered the house for the first time in days. I found her in the living room, sorting through old photos. She looked up, startled by my sudden arrival. John, she asked. My chest heaved with barely contained emotion. Lauren McCarthy, I began. My voice quivered. I need to say something. She set down the pictures, standing slowly. Yes? I stepped closer, fists clenched at my sides. My voice was rough, heavy with unshed tears. I loved you. Still do, in some broken way. And when I saw you with him, I trailed off, swallowing. I've never felt a pain that deep. And I've been punishing you, punishing myself, because I don't know how to handle it. She nodded, tears gathering. I know. I took a shuddering breath. I can't forgive what you did yet. Maybe never. But I want to stop drowning in this hate. I want to find a way to move forward, with or without you. Her lip trembled. John, I'm so sorry. If I could go back. Don't, I said, voice cracking. The past is done. We can't change it. She covered her mouth with her hand, muffling a sob. I stared at her, heart pounding, feeling the swirl of heartbreak, anger, and a faint stir of what we once shared. Tomorrow, I said quietly, we sign the papers. We let this house go. Then, maybe we talk about everything else. Maybe not. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I turned away, stumbling back toward the trailer. My eyes burned, but I didn't let the tears fall. A man does not cry, I reminded myself. But the pain was a living thing inside me, almost unbearable. In the morning, we drove separately to the title company's office. signed the final documents, handed over keys. The house was no longer ours. I felt a numbness settle in my chest as we left. Lauren McCarthy hovered near me in the parking lot, her expression uncertain. I stuffed my hands in my pockets. I guess that's it. She looked at me with watery eyes. Where will you go? I shrugged. There's a small RV park on the outskirts of town. I might crash there for a while. Live in the trailer. She hesitated. Could we meet for coffee sometime? Talk. For a long moment I said nothing. Then I gave a stiff nod. Maybe. She closed her eyes, relief washing over her features. We stood in awkward silence. Part of me wanted to gather her in my arms, to cling to a shred of what we once had. But the memory of Michael Ross, the note, the betrayal, all flared in my mind. Instead, I turned away, jaw clenched. Good luck, I muttered. John. She started, but I walked off. I got in my truck, heart pounding, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of her standing there in the lot, arms wrapped around her torso like she was trying to hold herself together. That night, I parked my trailer in a cramped spot at the RV park. It wasn't glamorous, but it had hookups for water and electricity, and it was cheap. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the stained ceiling. My entire life had changed in a matter of weeks. The house was gone, my marriage was in tatters, and I had no job. Yet for the first time, I felt the faintest stirring of something like possibility. Perhaps I could piece myself together here, slowly, day by day. In the small hours before dawn, I finally allowed myself to shed a single tear. It trailed down my cheek, hot and humiliating. But no one saw. I was alone in that trailer, with only the quiet hum of distant traffic for company. And as the tear slipped away, I whispered into the darkness, I'll survive. It wasn't a roar of triumph. It wasn't a vow of renewed love. It was just the raw truth. I was still here, broken but alive, with the faintest ember of hope flickering in my chest. The next day, I drove back to the old neighborhood, parking near the curb across from our former house. The new owners were moving in. I watched them carry furniture through the front door, their laughter drifting across the street. Part of me felt like a ghost, haunting the place that used to be my home. I imagined Lauren McCarthy somewhere in her new apartment, maybe thinking of me. Maybe not. I thought of that note again. Say it was a mistake. Say you were scared. It's not about sex. You love him. Her script. She tried so many times to recite it, to apologize, to salvage something. I'd chosen silence, an unrelenting Cold War that left us both hollow. But maybe that was the only way I knew how to cope. Maybe I needed that space to nurse my wounds. For the first time, I felt a slight pang of pity for her. She wasn't sleeping with him anymore. She'd ended it, or so Michael Ross claimed. Her remorse was genuine. I could see it in her eyes. But the damage was done. My trust was shattered. I sighed, started my engine, and pulled away. That chapter of my life was closed. Whether we had a future together was uncertain. Whether I could ever forgive her was uncertain. But I knew one thing. I was done living in that suspended agony. At the next traffic light, I checked my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. Just a single text from an unknown number. Probably him again, or maybe someone else. I didn't open it. Instead, I pressed the power button, hearing the soft click as the screen went dark. I wanted no more intrusions into my quiet space. I turned onto the highway, letting the city recede in my mirror. This was my new beginning, scared, broken, and entirely uncertain. I could feel the heaviness still in my chest, but the raw edge of my anger had dulled slightly. Maybe time would erode it further. Maybe it would always haunt me. Either way, I reminded myself, a man doesn't cry. So I pressed my lips together, gripped the wheel, and drove on into the fading light. A single thought echoed in my mind, heavy with bittersweet resignation. I'm still here. And for now, that has to be enough.